I hired a plumber while my daughter and her husband were away, and an hour into the job he called me from the basement sounding like he'd seen a ghost. Let me back up. My name is Arthur. I'm 64 years old, retired from 31 years as a high school principal in Guelph, Ontario. My wife passed 8 years ago from a stroke. Sudden, no warning, just gone on a Tuesday morning in October. After that, it was just me and my daughter Simone, and honestly, she became the center of my world. I watched her grieve, watched her rebuild, watched her fall in love with a man named Philip, watched her marry him in our backyard on a September afternoon that I thought was the happiest day I'd had since her mother died. I should have looked harder at Philip on that day. I should have noticed the way he held the champagne glass just a little too tight and scanned the crowd when he thought nobody was watching. But you want your kid to be happy, don't you? You tell yourself the unease is just overprotective father instinct. You tell yourself to let her live her life. Simone and Philip had a son, my grandson Callum, 4 years ago. Bright, funny little boy with his mother's eyes and his grandmother's stubbornness. He walks into a room and the room gets warmer. I drove up to their house in Kitchener at least twice a month just to read him stories and watch him eat scrambled eggs like it was the most serious task he'd ever been assigned. The house in Kitchener was a nice one. 3 bedrooms, finished basement, good-sized yard. Philip had bought it before they married with money he said came from a settlement. He'd been in a car accident in his 20s, got a payout, invested it. That was the story. I had no reason to question it. About a year after Callum was born, my wife's life insurance matured in a way that released a secondary policy, a thing her financial planner had set up that I'd honestly forgotten about. The payout came to me, and after talking to my own advisor, I decided to put some of it toward Callum's future. Simone and I sat down and worked out a formal arrangement, $60,000 into a registered education savings account in Callum's name, with Simone as co-trustee. It was clean, it was documented, it was done through a family lawyer in Guelph I'd known for 20 years. The money was for Callum. Only for Callum. I want to be clear about that because it matters later. Simone called me in March and said she and Philip were taking a trip to Costa Rica. 2 weeks. A gift to themselves for their 5th anniversary. I asked about Callum, and she said he'd be staying with Philip's mother in Hamilton. Fine. Good even. I said, have a wonderful time. I meant it. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing, was that Philip's mother had called Simone 3 days before the flight and cancelled. Family emergency, she said. A nephew in Vancouver had been hospitalized. She was sorry she couldn't take Callum. What I also didn't know was that Philip had told Simone not to call me about it. He said he'd made other arrangements. The other arrangement, as I would discover, was no arrangement at all. 2 days after they left, the pipe under the basement utility sink started leaking. I know this because Simone had given me a key to the house years ago, back when they'd first moved in and asked me to check on things whenever they were away. I had a habit of stopping by once a week, watering the plant she kept on the kitchen windowsill, making sure the thermostat hadn't done anything strange. It was mid-March and still cold in Ontario. That particular Tuesday I called the plumber because I could hear the drip from the top of the basement stairs. And water and cold weather and old pipe fittings are a combination that ends badly. I used a company I'd used before, a local outfit run by a man named Ted who I'd hired twice for my own place. Ted sent one of his guys, a young fellow named Kevin, and I let him in and told him the sink was in the back corner of the basement and I'd be upstairs making tea if he needed anything. I was standing at the kitchen counter when my phone rang. Kevin, not a text, a call. Mr. Arthur. His voice was wrong. Too low, too careful. Can you come down here? There's something you need to see. My first thought was the pipe had burst. I went down the stairs already bracing for water on the floor. Kevin was standing outside the door to the small storage room at the back of the basement, the one Philip used as a kind of utility room, shelves of tools and boxes and an old chest freezer. The door was closed. Kevin was just standing there looking at it. I heard something, he said. I was on the floor under the sink and I heard it through the wall, something moving, and then a little voice. I looked at him. He's maybe 26 years old, this young man, and he looked genuinely rattled. I knocked on the storage room door. Nothing for a second. Then, hello. A child's voice. I tried the handle. Locked. I looked at Kevin, and he looked at me, and I went up those stairs faster than I have moved in years. Found the key ring Simone had given me, went through every key until one of them, a small one I'd never had occasion to use, fit the lock on that door. Callum was sitting in the corner behind a plastic shelving unit with a flashlight that was starting to die, a single blanket, 2 bottles of water, and half a bag of crackers. He was 4 years old. He was in that basement in March, in a house where the heat was set to 16 degrees, with a flashlight and crackers. I don't have words for what moved through me in that moment. I've tried to find them and I can't. I crossed the room and picked him up and held him for a long time. He didn't cry. That was almost the worst part. He just pressed his face into my shoulder and said, "Grandpa, I was waiting." He'd been waiting. Kevin called from the doorway asking if he should call 911. I said yes. While we waited for the ambulance, I kept Callum wrapped in his blanket and sat with him in the kitchen with the oven on for warmth, and his hands wrapped around a mug of warm apple juice. He told me in the way 4-year-olds tell things, not in order, not all at once, that Daddy had said to stay in the special room and not make noise and someone would come and check on him. He'd been down there since Saturday. It was Tuesday. 3 days. 3 days with crackers and water and a dying flashlight in a cold basement. Saturday to Tuesday. The paramedics checked him over and said he was dehydrated and cold, but physically okay. They were kind to him. One of them, a woman about my daughter's age, caught my eye over his head, and the look she gave me was not a clinical look. It was the look of a person trying very hard not to say something she wasn't supposed to say. I called Simone from the hospital. She answered on the 3rd ring, sounding like she was outside somewhere. Birds and wind and the kind of relaxed voice a person has when they're on vacation, and everything is fine. "Dad, is everything okay?" "Simone," I said, "where is Callum right now?" A pause. "He's with Philip's mom." "No," I said. "He isn't. He's in the hospital next to me with a heated blanket and a juice box, and the nurses know his name now. He was in the basement, Simone. He was in the storage room for 3 days. The silence on the other end of the phone was the longest silence I have ever heard from my daughter. Then she said, very quietly, "What?" I told her what Kevin had found and what the paramedics had said and where we were. I kept my voice even. I'm a retired high school principal. I spent 31 years managing crises involving other people's children, and I know how to keep my voice even. I did not keep my voice even for long. By the time I finished talking, I was standing in a hospital corridor in Kitchener, Ontario, shaking. Simone said she was coming home. She said she hadn't known. I believed her immediately and completely, because I know my daughter, and because the sound she made when I finished explaining was not the sound of guilt. It was the sound of a person's world collapsing. Philip's flight home was quiet, according to Simone. She said he spent most of it staring out the window. When they got to the hospital, and she ran to Callum, Philip stood in the doorway of the room for a long moment, and then said something about how he'd thought Callum would be fine. It was only a few days he'd left enough supplies. Enough supplies. Kevin had already given a statement to the police. The responding officers had taken mine at the hospital. Philip was interviewed that night. He was not arrested immediately. I learned later this was because they needed to establish the full timeline and consult with child welfare. But a Children's Aid Society worker was involved within 24 hours, and Philip was told he was not to be alone with Callum under any circumstances. I want to tell you what happened in the weeks that followed because the slow grind of it was its own kind of thing. Simone stayed at her mother's sister's place in Guelph with Callum while the investigation moved forward. She filed for separation in April. Her lawyer, a woman in Waterloo who I'm told doesn't lose, moved for emergency custody and got it. Philip got supervised visits, 2 hours once a week in a CAS office with a worker present. Philip, it turned out, had been using money from Callum's education account, the account Simone co-managed, the one I'd funded with $60,000 from my wife's insurance policy. He had found a way, through a joint account that he and Simone used for household expenses, and through some paperwork that Simone had signed without reading carefully enough. She was 3 months postpartum and exhausted, and she has never forgiven herself for this. And I have told her many times that predatory people count on exactly that kind of exhaustion to transfer funds in increments small enough that they didn't trigger immediate alerts. Over 3 years, he'd moved just over $22,000. He had bought a truck, not a used truck, not a practical work truck, a new one, $44,000. He'd covered the rest with a loan he'd taken in his name only, but $22,000 of it was Callum's education money, my wife's money, the money I'd set aside looking at a little boy eating scrambled eggs and thinking about who he'd become. The family lawyer in Guelph, the one I mentioned, the one I'd known for 20 years, helped us pursue a civil claim alongside the criminal process. The criminal charges Philip ultimately faced with child abandonment and failure to provide the necessities of life under the Criminal Code of Canada. His lawyer tried to argue that 3 days was not an unreasonable period, given the provisions left, and that he had intended to make alternative arrangements. The provisions. The crackers. The judge did not find this argument persuasive. I testified. I was not planning to testify. Simone's lawyer said it might not be necessary, but when the moment came, I wanted to. I'm not someone who speaks about grief easily. I keep things close, but I sat in that courtroom and I thought about Callum saying, "Grandpa, I was waiting." And I thought about my wife and the policy she'd spent years paying into because she wanted her grandchildren to have a good start, and I said everything I needed to say. Philip was convicted. He received a sentence that included time in custody, followed by a period of probation, and was ordered to pay restitution for the misappropriated funds. His driver's license was suspended, something to do with the loan fraud that came up during the investigation. The truck was eventually seized. The thing I keep coming back to, the thing that sits with me, is not the courtroom or the conviction or even the basement. It's the Tuesday morning in March when I stopped by to water a plant. I almost didn't go that day. It was cold. I had a dentist appointment in the afternoon. I told myself I could go Wednesday instead. I stood in my kitchen for a minute drinking coffee and thinking about whether to bother. I decided to bother. Callum just turned 5 in November. He's in junior kindergarten now, a school about 6 minutes from my house, because Simone moved back to Guelph in the summer, and I have never once complained about the commute. I pick him up 2 days a week. He talks the entire way home about things that are very important to him. The social dynamics of the sandbox, a book about trains, whether or not clouds are alive. I take all of it completely seriously. He doesn't talk about the basement. His therapist says this is normal, that children that age process things in ways that don't always look like processing. She's a good therapist. I asked around and found her myself. And the provincial funding for children's mental health services covered a portion of the cost, which in Ontario can sometimes take a while to navigate, but eventually we got it sorted. Simone is doing better. Not fine. Better. She says those are different things, and she's right. She's a careful, loving mother who married someone who hid what he was, and she is rebuilding in the particular slow way that people rebuild when the betrayal was intimate. I don't rush her. I make her tea when she comes over, and I let her sit in silence if she needs to sit in silence. The education account, after the legal proceedings, was restored to approximately $38,000, the original 60 minus the 22 that were taken, plus the restitution order which will be paid back over time. Simone's lawyer and I worked with a financial advisor to restructure it with better protections. It's solid now. It's Callum's. I think about what would have happened if I hadn't gone to the house that Tuesday. I think about it in the way you think about things at 64 at 2 in the morning when you can't sleep, circling it, not quite touching the center of it. 3 days was already too long. The crackers would have run out. The water would have run out. The flashlight had already run out. I watered the plant, by the way. It was still on the windowsill. Some kind of succulent Simone had had for years. It looked a little dry. It's doing fine now. She brought it with her when she moved. It's on the windowsill in her apartment in Guelph, 6 minutes from my house, right next to a drawing Callum made of the two of them standing in front of what appears to be either a house or a very large hamburger. He says it's a house. I believe him. Some things you tend to. You show up, you water them, and they make it through. I keep thinking about the truck. $44,000 sitting in a driveway in Kitchener, paid for partly with money my wife spent years setting aside for a little boy she never got to know well enough. She was careful with money. Not because we had a lot of it, but because she understood that what you build quietly over time is what protects the people you love after you're gone. She wasn't thinking about trucks. She was thinking about Callum's first year of university, about the options he'd have, about the kind of start that opens doors instead of closing them. And Philip looked at that and saw something he could use. That's the thing about people who take from children. They don't think of themselves as the kind of person who would do that. They find a way to frame it as temporary, as justified, as something they'll correct later. The self-deception required to leave a 4-year-old in a cold basement with crackers and a dying flashlight and tell yourself it's fine, someone will check. That isn't a momentary lapse. That's a pattern of thinking that's been practiced for a long time. You don't arrive at that decision. You drift there slowly by making 100 smaller choices that each teach you a little more about what you're willing to do. What I've come to understand is that how a person treats someone who cannot hold them accountable tells you everything. Callum couldn't call a lawyer. Callum couldn't report to anyone. Callum could only wait, in the dark, and trust that someone would come. And Philip knew that, and made his choices accordingly. I don't say this with rage anymore. I said it with rage for a long time, lying awake at 2 a.m, running through everything I missed, everything I should have seen. Every moment I told myself I was being an overprotective father. Now I say it more plainly. Some people lack the basic honesty with themselves to do right by the people in their care. That honesty, the kind that makes you look clearly at what you're doing and who you're doing it to, is not a soft quality. It is the foundation of everything. Without it, intelligence becomes a tool for manipulation, and strength becomes a justification for harm. Simone has it. She has always had it. What she's had to develop painfully over this past year is the kind of clear-eyed judgment that doesn't soften when it should hold firm. She trusted because she loved, and she was exhausted, and the person she trusted had spent years making himself seem trustworthy. She is not to blame for that. But I watch her now, the way she asks hard questions, the way she reads things before she signs them, the way she moves more carefully in the world. And I see someone who has paid a terrible price for a hard education and who is using it. Callum is 5. He talks about clouds and trains and the social politics of the kindergarten sandbox. He doesn't know yet what it costs to get him to this ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Someday he will, in pieces, in whatever way it surfaces for him. What I want him to have by then, what I hope Simone and I are building for him every day in the smallest ways, is the sense that the people who love you show up. Not dramatically, not with speeches. They just show up, and they keep showing up, even when it's cold and inconvenient and there's a dentist appointment in the afternoon. I almost didn't go that Tuesday. I went. That's the whole story, really.